Some paradoxes exist that, like a thin crack in a monolithic wall, force you to question the strength of the entire structure. Our entire history is built on a foundation of supposedly unshakable truths, the greatness of the Enlightenment, the genius of past architects, and the continuous path of progress. We marvel at the luxurious palaces of Europe and Russia, where gold dazzles the eye and the architecture defies gravity. The Hermitage, Versailles, Peterhof. These names are synonymous with power and cultural splendor, but one only needs to look closer at the details, and behind the gilded facade, something absurd emerges, something so illogical that the mind refuses to accept it. In these masterpieces, where every line of the facade and the acoustics of every hall were meticulously planned, the architects missed one tiny yet vital detail. The official history taught in schools and recounted on tours asks us to accept a version of the world that is full of contradictions. We are shown images of enlightened monarchs and a brilliant aristocracy dressed in silks and powdered wigs, but in the same breath we are told about the customs of the era. Historians sheepishly mumble that European nobility wasn't known for its cleanliness, that they relieved themselves behind heavy curtains in the hallways or in portable chamber pots, the contents of which were then simply poured out of the windows. We're asked to believe that the greatest minds of that time, capable of calculating the load of multi-ton domes, simply couldn't figure out how to lay a ceramic pipe to carry away waste. But this argument crumbles upon its first contact with reality. We need only look at the hydraulic systems of these very same palace complexes. Peterhof and Versailles are not just fountains. They are hymns to engineering, symphonies of water. They feature incredibly complex systems of communicating vessels, reservoirs, and sloughs that carry water from dozens of kilometers away under immense pressure to create a spectacle of jets soaring into the sky. And all of this was achieved without a single electric pump, powered exclusively by gravity and brilliant calculations. The engineers of that era possessed a knowledge of hydraulics that could stump many modern graduates of technical universities. They control the element of water with surgical precision. And this is where the main question arises, shattering our entire worldview. How could a civilization capable of building the Samson fountain, where a column of water shoots 20 meters high, forget about the most basic form of plumbing? If you can create such a marvel of engineering, then designing a simple slope in the floor and running a pipe to a cesspool outside the palace is a task for a kindergartner. This isn't just an oddity, it's a technological absurdity. Such a discrepancy cannot be an accident or a cultural quirk. It is a direct indication that we are dealing with a lie. The official explanations are just a clumsy screen designed to hide an inconvenient, foul-smelling truth. This seemingly minor domestic question, the absence of toilets, is the very thread that when pulled can unravel the entire fabric of history as we know it. We are beginning an investigation where this paradox will become the key to unlocking a global mystery that changes everything. To fully grasp the depth of this contradiction, one must immerse themselves in the magnificent engineering genius frozen in the fountain complexes of Peterhof and Versailles. These are not mere decorative elements of the landscape, but a triumph of hydraulic science. Official science claims that the fountain system of Peterhof, created in the 18th century, operates solely on the force of gravity. Water from the Rapshaw Heights, located dozens of kilometers from the palace, is collected in a complex network of ponds and channels. From there, it rushes downward toward the sea through a system of cast-iron pipes. And the difference in elevation creates colossal pressure, capable of launching multi-ton columns of water more than 20 meters high. This only sounds beautiful and simple in theory. In practice, implementing such a project requires more than just digging ditches with surf labor. It demands a perfect mathematical calculation of the gradient, precise down to the millimeter over many kilometers. The slightest error in design would cause the water to either stagnate or burst the pipes in low-lying areas. And here we encounter the first artifact that defies the general historical narrative, the quality of the pipes themselves. During restorations of the old systems, engineers find fragments of pipes cast from an iron of such quality that it surpasses many modern equivalents. These are pipelines with perfectly smooth interiors capable of withstanding immense pressure for decades, with joints whose precision and reliability rival modern flange technologies. The question arises, how could a civilization that, according to historians, couldn't manage mass production of ceramic toilets and sewage drains for the imperial palace be capable of casting kilometers of such high-strength complex pipes? That's like finding the engine of a supersonic jet in a horse-drawn cart. And now let's move from the spacious parks bathed in pristine water into the palaces themselves, into their hall of mirrors and ballrooms. The picture that history paints for us stands in stark contrast to this external splendor. We are assured that within these walls, where the fates of empires were decided, a choking stench reigned. The air was thick with the heavy scent of perfume, which it is claimed was invented not for seduction, but to mask the nauseating smell of unwashed bodies and human waste that it seeped into the velvet drapes and expensive tapestries. Kings, empresses, dukes, and ladies-in-waiting, dressed in silks and lace, were forced to use chamber pots or find a secluded corner behind a curtain. This is presented as the norm for the time, as some kind of cultural peculiarity. But herein lies the main technological oxymoron that breaks all logic of historical development. It is impossible to imagine a society that possesses the knowledge to control the element of water with such surgical precision, yet lives in domestic filth. Technologies develop as a whole. If you have mastered complex metallurgy and hydraulics to create fountains, then creating primitive sanitation becomes a secondary elementary task. This is not just a design flaw or a cultural misunderstanding. It is proof that the fountains and the palaces are systems of different technological levels which could not have been created by the same people in the same era. A civilization that created the Ferrari engine of fountain systems somehow didn't bother to install it in the cart of domestic comfort, continuing to use horses in the form of chamber pots. This state of affairs contradicts all common sense and the logic of technological progress. This leads us to a shocking yet uniquely logical hypothesis. What if those who used this cart simply didn't know how to start and use the complex engine? What if the magnificent hydraulic system was an autonomous perpetual machine inherited by the new masters of the palaces in a ready-to-use state? They could admire its operation, demonstrate its power as a symbol of their authority, but they had neither the knowledge nor the technology to interfere with its design, to redirect even a small fraction of that colossal flow of water for basic hygienic needs. What if the inhabitants of the palaces and their original builders were entirely different civilizations? This hypothesis, which seems fantastical at first glance, takes on a chilling logic as soon as we stop looking at the palaces as the creations of their famous inhabitants and start seeing them as inherited high-tech objects. Imagine a group of people who, having survived some cataclysm, find an abandoned modern city. They enter skyscrapers, see elevators, but don't understand how they work and use the cabins as storage closets. They see complex ventilation systems, but not knowing how to turn them on, they break up the vents because of the draft. They find bathrooms, but the water and sewage systems are offline or damaged, and they don't know how to fix them. As a result, they begin to relieve themselves in the hallways because that is the only thing that aligns with their current level of understanding. This is precisely the scenario of primitive use and appropriation that we observe in the history of the 15th to 18th centuries. It is a classic cargo cult, but on a planetary scale, where instead of straw airplanes, we have the settlement of stone masterpieces left behind by a previous, far more advanced civilization. The evidence for this theory is woven into the very architectural DNA of these buildings. Let's start with the most basic need in northern latitudes: heating. The enormous halls of the Winter Palace or Versailles, with their towering ceilings of 5 to 6 meters and gigantic windows, they are colossal sources of heat loss, are equipped with only small, almost decorative fireplaces. Anyone familiar with basic physics understands that it is impossible to heat such a hangar with a small fireplace in the harsh winter when it's 30 degrees below zero outside. Even if you burned entire groves of trees in them, all the heat would immediately rise to the ceiling, leaving the space below freezing.
Official history tells us that monarchs and courtiers wore fur coats right inside the palace. But why build a residence in a northern climate with the thermal insulation of a summer pavilion? It's not just illogical, it's suicidal. Unless, of course, these buildings were originally designed for completely different climate control technologies. Theories exist that complex systems of air ducts were laid within the thick walls of these palaces, heating the rooms from the inside using some form of free energy. The fireplaces we see today are crude and clumsy insertions made by later settlers who didn't understand how to turn on the main system, so they simply punched chimney holes where none had existed, destroying the original engineering just to avoid freezing. But the most obvious and disturbing evidence concerns the scale. The architecture of these palaces is clearly not designed for a person of average height. There are gigantic, massive doors reaching 4 to 5 meters in height, with door handles located at face level or even higher. To open such a door, an average person needs to exert considerable effort and reach up. The steps on the grand staircases are often disproportionately high and wide, making them awkward to climb. One doesn't walk but practically scrambles up them. Mirrors in the halls hang so high that it's impossible to see oneself without standing on a ladder. All of this, from the general proportions of the halls in which a person feels like an insect, to the small details of the fittings, indicates that these spaces were created for beings of a much greater stature. All these details, the inability to manage simple utilities despite the presence of highly complex external engineering, the crude attempts to resolve the heating problem, and most importantly, the inhuman scale of the buildings, form a single consistent picture. The palaces were not built for the kings and emperors whose names we know from textbooks. We are Lilliputians who have settled in the abandoned homes of Gullivers. We admire the stucco work, but cannot replicate the composition of the mortar that has held for centuries. We look at the perfectly fitted granite blocks and cannot explain what tools were used to process them with such precision. We simply arrived at ready-made stone mansions, cleaned them of dirt, and began to live in them, adapting them to our primitive needs as best we could. But if this is true, then two more even more frightening questions inevitably arise. Where did the former true owners of these palaces go? And why were their majestic homes abandoned and empty, ready to receive new tenants? The answer to this mystery may not lie in the heavens or ancient texts, but right beneath our feet. The evidence of this civilizational replacement is not confined to the interiors of palaces. It is literally on the surface, or rather just beneath it, visible to any unbiased observer. One only needs to walk down a street in the historic center of any old city in the world, be it St. Petersburg, Paris, Rome, or Moscow, and look carefully at the bases of the old buildings. We are confronted with a disturbing and widespread anomaly. The windows of the first floors are halfway or even completely sunken into the ground. We see the upper part of a window arch peeking out from under the asphalt, while the windowsill is deep beneath the feet of passers-by. Often one can also find doors that now lead into a solid wall of earth. This is a question frozen in stone to which official history gives a completely unconvincing answer. They explain this phenomenon with the so-called cultural layer. The theory states that over centuries, people brought so much dirt on their shoes and street cleaners did such a poor job that the ground level naturally rose by 3 and sometimes even 5 meters. Consider the absurdity of this. 5 meters is the height of a 1.5-story building. If we believe the official version, our ancestors voluntarily lived in a planetary-scale pigsty, where for centuries they did not remove trash and waste, but simply compacted it, building new roads on top of the old ones. But this theory crumbles at the slightest contact with logic and facts. Who in their right mind would design a building with full-sized, beautifully decorated windows and grand entrances on the first floor, knowing that in 100 years they would be underground? Who would create expensive brickwork, arches, and decorative elements there which no one would ever see? When archaeologists or construction workers excavate the foundations of these buildings, they discover that these so-called basements are in fact complete first floors. They have windows, doors, often even traces of balconies, everything a ground floor should have. The answer is obvious, and it is both simple and terrifying. These floors were not built underground. They ended up there as a result of a catastrophe. Researchers call this phenomenon the mud flood, a global cataclysm that in the not-so-distant past buried cities across the entire planet under a multi-meter layer of clay, sand, and soil. Some event occurred, perhaps a comet impact or a series of massive eruptions which threw billions of tons of rock into the atmosphere and then dropped it onto the surface.
Official history blames it all on accidents. Wooden buildings, a fallen candle, a cow kicking over a kerosene lamp. But these explanations seem childish when we look at photos of the aftermath. Cities built of stone, brick, and granite burned to the ground as if doused with napalm from the sky. Stone doesn't burn, but in pictures from that time we see granite blocks and marble columns that have crumbled to sand. This suggests exposure to temperatures unattainable in a normal fire. This was a deliberate cleanup. It wasn't just houses being destroyed, it was evidence. And most importantly, with particular thoroughness and inevitability, these fires consumed archives, libraries, city halls, and patent offices. The flames devoured census records, old maps, blueprints, and technical documentation. All the memory that could have told the truth about the real timeline and technological level of the past. This process has continued for centuries, from the Library of Alexandria to the Indian Library in Moscow. Every time too many inconvenient artifacts accumulated in one place, a spontaneous fire would occur. We were left with only carefully filtered and rewritten textbooks, which told us how illiterate peasants with primitive chisels and hammers created masterpieces that we cannot accurately replicate today, even with lasers and computer modeling. The second, even more cynical method of concealing the truth was the grand spectacle of the world's fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, Brussels. The official version claims that for these events, gigantic exhibition pavilions in the classical or neoclassical style were erected in just 1 or 2 years from temporary materials. We are told that entire cities with domes, colonnades, artificial canals, complex sculptural compositions, and full electric illumination were built from staff, a mixture of plaster, straw, and horsehair. And after the exhibition, which lasted a few months, all this splendor was ruthlessly demolished and dismantled. Only someone who has never seen photos of these temporary structures could believe this. These were monumental buildings surpassing the Capitol or St. Peter's Basilica in architectural quality, complexity, and scale. The idea that such objects could be created from plaster in a year and then simply destroyed is a mockery of common sense and the laws of physics. The terrible truth is that these cities weren't built for the fairs. They were excavated. They were miraculously preserved districts, not completely buried by the cultural layer of that very ancient civilization of gods. They were restored, cleaned up, connected to electricity, which was perhaps part of their original infrastructure, and shown to an astonished public. But this was presented not as a legacy of the past, but as an incredible achievement of the modern industrial era, an architectural fantasy. People were shown working, moving sidewalks, wireless energy transmission, and complex acoustic systems. But it was all served up as a temporary attraction, and then, after closing, these complexes were ruthlessly blown up and leveled. Why? Because they were too perfect. They revealed a level of technology that could not be explained by the steam engine and manual labor. They were a living reproach to the new primitive reality. The elites who seized power after the cataclysm needed to erase the very memory of a golden age, turning it into a fairground spectacle and then physically destroying it. They were afraid that people, upon seeing this, would start asking inconvenient questions. If we can build this from plaster in a year, why do we live in dirty, cramped brick boxes? So the palaces were dynamited, their rubble dumped into bodies of water to create new embankments, and history was definitively rewritten. This was the final stage of the cleanup, the destruction of the most obvious, most beautiful, and most perfect material evidence of the God civilization. They erased our memory, destroyed the physical evidence, and wrote a new history convenient for controlling us. They convinced us that we are slowly and painfully moving along the path of progress, from a wooden splinter to an LED. And now, knowing all this, knowing about the buried cities, the empty streets, the millions of orphans, the great fires, and the disposable cities, how should we look at the world around us? Our investigation, which began with the simple and almost comical question about the lack of toilets in luxurious palaces, has led us down a frightening chain of discoveries, each link shattering our familiar worldview. That single inconsistency, one technological absurdity, turned out to be the very thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire tapestry of official history. We started with the contrast between the brilliant hydro-engineering of the fountains and the domestic squalor of their inhabitants, and we realized that the builders and the residents of the palaces could not have been the same people. Then, by analyzing the inhuman scale of the architecture itself, the giant doors, the awkward steps, the impossibility of heating, we realized that these buildings were not made for us. We are merely settlers, Lilliputians in the land of Gullivers, who have adapted foreign houses for our own needs. The search for an answer to where the true owners went led us to evidence of a global catastrophe, to the first floors of cities buried under meters of earth all over the world. This explained the lack of access to the original utilities and technologies. But the catastrophe created a new mystery. If the previous population perished, then where did we come from? The answer turned out to be even more shocking. The empty cities in the first photographs, the anomalous demographic explosion, and the millions of orphans in the 19th century all formed a single picture of a reset of humanity. We are the descendants of an artificially raised and settled generation, a civilization with severed roots and an erased memory. And finally, we saw how methodically and ruthlessly the last pieces of evidence were destroyed. The great fires that incinerated archives, and the grand spectacle of the world's fairs, where the excavated cities of the ancients were first displayed as a marvel of modernity, and then wiped from the face of the earth. This entire chain leads to a single, all-encompassing conclusion. The history we know is a fabrication. We are living in a world built on the ruins of a far more advanced civilization. But we have been convinced that these ruins are the pinnacle of our own achievements. Our path is presented to us as continuous progress, but in reality it is a carefully managed degradation. They gave us complex and fascinating gadgets to distract our attention, but in return they took away the technologies of free energy, longevity, and harmony with nature that our predecessors likely possessed. They proudly gave us central plumbing, but deprived us of the eternal, perfect architecture capable of standing for millennia. They convinced us that we are the pinnacle of creation, slowly crawling out of caves, when in fact we may be merely the feral descendants of gods who have forgotten their origins. We are a generation with amnesia. We wander among giant megalithic structures, granite embankments, and star forts, not understanding their true purpose. We admire them as works of art, when they might be components of a global energy or navigation system. We use a microscope to hammer nails and call that progress. We live in the graveyard of a great civilization, but we've been told it's a garden we grew ourselves. And the most terrifying part is that the process of replacement and memory erasure is not over. It is happening right now, before our very eyes. But the stones still cry out the truth. The millions of tons of granite and the perfectly fitted polygonal masonry around the world cannot be faked or attributed to the labor of slaves with copper chisels. They are silent witnesses that we are not the first ones here. And perhaps our most important task is not to build a new world, but to remember and try to understand the old one. To remember who we were before we were made to forget.